92nd Street Y online media is made possible by a generous gift in memory of Christopher Lightfoot Walker, a longtime friend of 92Y's Unterberg Poetry Center and the Paris Review. This program, part of an ongoing collaboration between the Poetry Center and the Review, features a Writers at Work interview with Denise Levertov. It was recorded on April 22, 1991, before a live audience at New York's 92nd Street Y.
I'd like to begin by saying that for those of you who are, as I am, very familiar with Denise Levertov's poetry and her books of prose, essays on poetics, I'm hoping that the questions don't feel too basic to you, but I hope you'll be patient with us. I'd like to begin by asking you a question. You've mentioned in your essays that you began writing when you were very young. What started you writing?
I think fairies, literally, because that's what I wrote about. Little people.
Fairies. Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Did you have an idea of what a poet meant then, or did you think of yourself as poet, or did you just put words on paper?
Actually, I didn't put words on paper because I did start making up poems before I'd learned to do that. And I had a poem for many years which my sister had taken down in dictation because I was 5. So I certainly didn't have an idea of what a poet was or think of myself as anything but me.
Right. That's very different for some of us who began much later. So, do you feel that there was an advantage to your thinking in poems very early?
I think there was a great advantage because the idea of poet, of being a poet, the idea of worldly ideas, competition and career and all those kind of things, which can be so bad for an artist, really didn't come into my head. I'd been writing for years before I became aware of those ideas, and I at quite an early age, I read a lot of Keats' letters, where he talks about fame, and I think I began to get this idea of wanting to do something which would stay there and not just sort of evaporate. But it was posthumous fame, I think, that was a sort of dangling idea for me, and not any kind of present acclaim. And then I was in such isolation. My family wrote various kinds of things. My sister wrote poetry, and both my parents wrote in different genres, but not poetry. But I didn't know anyone of my own age. My sister was 9 years older, who wrote, and I didn't go to school. So I was very fortunate, I think, in avoiding all the kind of competition and anxiety and so forth. It was just between me and the poem.
Your first book appeared in 1946, isn't that right? Has the process by which a poem comes into being for you changed since then through all of your books, or is it basically the same sort of process?
I don't think it's really changed. I think that as the decades, a lot of decades, have gone by, and I've long also been a teacher, and I've written essays and so forth. Of course, part of my mind has been occupied with questions of craft and form and so forth. But I think when I'm actually writing, the process is probably not much different from what it was when I was a kid.
How do ideas come to you for poems, or how does a poem begin? Does it begin with a phrase, or do you approach it by way of subject? In other words, approach it with no language, or do you begin with language?
I never begin until there's some language there, but for me, sometimes there is a subject which I know I would like to write about, but I don't embark on writing about it. I try to live with it until some phrase, some opening crystallizes for me. And that's what I tell my students to try to do too, instead of trying to think of how to say it, you know.
Right.
But sometimes it's a phrase out of nowhere.
Right.
So both of those ways, I would say.
Right. Changes. Do you keep a schedule for writing?
No, I often wish I did, but
You don't have like a particular time of day?
I like to keep the mornings to myself. I don't always succeed. I sometimes shut off the telephone, but then if you're expecting a plumber or something like that, there's no way you can do that. You can keep off your friends, but you can't keep off the plumber. You're lucky to have him, you know, deign to visit. So,
well, when you say that you keep the mornings free, do you throw out a lot of what you write? In other words, do you write and then that just doesn't come into anything, or do you wait for the poem? Do you do a lot of
I don't
thinking?
really throw out a lot. I mean, while I'm writing a poem, it often goes through a lot of drafts, so lots of drafts get thrown out, but I don't seem to throw away too many complete attempts. I mean,
Right.
Sometimes I put things aside and forget that I ever started on them, because I did think they were terrible, and then but I haven't thrown them out, and I have found them and been able to go back to them and develop them. But of course, I throw some things away, certainly. Yeah.
Is there I mean, it's probably depends on the poem, no doubt, but if we can say on the average, how long does it take for the arc of a poem to complete itself for you?
For the which of a poem?
The arc of a poem, like from the beginning draft to what you consider a finished draft. Do you have any?
It varies. I think it varies a lot. You've probably had the experience yourself of being given a short poem that just seems to come of itself, and maybe you add a comma or something, or you switch one word. Right. Occasionally that happens, and then there are poems, the longer a poem, the more drafts it goes through, I think, because that kind of given doesn't occur in anything but very short poems, in my experience.
No, it's very rare for me.
Yeah, yes.
Do you tend to hear poems more than you see them?
Well, seeing them and hearing them are virtually
really
identical, because I have this very strong belief and sense that the poem on the page is a score, like a musical score.
Right.
So there isn't
so
really...
So that it's a visualization of scoring.
Yes.
Well, it's interesting because I tend to often to see them as a built thing, and I think you write about that too, the idea of building a poem, but scoring is, I guess, another way of building a poem. Well, you've written definitive essays, of course, about the organic forms which poems find. Do your poems find form in the first drafts, or does that come later? I mean, as you score the poem, is there ever a discrepancy between how you first get the poem down and how the poem is finally going to appear.
Yes, actually, going back to an earlier question of yours about whether there was a difference in the way that I wrote now from in the past, I would say that I have become more. I've probably departed more from the early draft form than I did, let's say in the 1950s or early 60s, where I tended to think that the initial form had a kind of inviolability, and I think I've less and less thought that, and more tried to push and shove and reorganize to some degree, always with the feeling that the poem's form was inherent in the material, and that I was finding it and not imposing it.
Right.
But I think I've taken more trouble over finding it.
Right. As the time has gone on.
As time's gone by. Mm-hmm.
Do you, is there a process of, say, longhand? Do you write out in longhand?
Yes.
And is there a particular time then that you go to the typewriter, and does that make a difference?
I write longhand, and when I think that I've got a finished draft, I go to make a fair copy longhand, and it almost invariably happens that the fair copy turns out not to be a fair copy because I make some change in the process of writing it out. And so I might go on doing that for a number of times, and then I write it out longhand without making any changes, and then it seems to be ready to be typed. But then the same kind of thing might happen on the typewriter. I happen to type very badly. I use only a manual typewriter, and I usually type something up before I give it to my typist to type up, because I can't make a clean copy. But
so by the time you get to the typewriter, then you feel that
well,
the
I
poem
still
is pretty-
sometimes make more changes, because you know that kind of funny difference that there is between seeing
Absolutely.
something in your own handwriting.
Right.
They've still got all this sort of uterine material clinging to it, you know, like it's trailing its umbilical cord.
Intimate.
And-
It's a much more intimate
Yeah,
thing that hand.
and you put it in type, and you see it newly. Lines that looked awfully long to you in longhand turn out not to be all that long after all. Things like that.
Well, I don't know if this is getting into an area you don't want to get into, but what are you like when you work? Can you leave and come back to your work easily? I mean, if the poem has you, is it easy for you to walk away from it and go, say, to go teach, or to let the plumber in, or
Not too bad. Yeah,
that is
I can
fairly
usually
easy.
keep track. Yeah.
Since you arrived in America in 1949,
48.
48, you've lived.
End of 48.
End of 48. You've lived on the East Coast, and now you live on the West Coast. Does landscape influence the poems you make? And
I don't know if it influences the quality of the poems, but it certainly has gotten into the subject matter a lot. Yes.
well, also, I mean, just the sense of a bigger expanse. For instance, in California, I mean, you're able to see a longer way, say, than you do when you look out a window in Boston, where you lived. I mean,
Well,
do you
it's
find
true that
there's
when
a
I
different
look out,
pressure?
I mean, I don't live in California except for 3 months
Right.
a year.
Well,
I
that's
live in
true.
Seattle now, but when I look out the window in California, I do see more than I could see in Somerville, Massachusetts, in Davis Square. Yes. But I don't have a great wide vista. I see more sky. And where I live in Seattle, I see a good deal more sky, more trees. I can see the lake, and from one upstairs window I can see a bit of Mount Rainier. When it's out. Yes. But who would want a mountain that was out all the time? You'd stop seeing it, you know.
Or you'd stop
So
writing
wonderful
poems.
when it comes and goes. So, no, I don't think in the sense of expansiveness or not particularly. It's
just
really
in
more a
terms of-
matter of vegetation and
Right.
kinds
Nest.
of light and things like that.
Is there someplace special in your house that's especially conducive to writing? Do you move around the house to write? I mean, do you have to sit at, do you just have one place? Like, can you sit at
Well,
a
I
desk?
do have a workroom that is where I supposedly write.
Can
but
you
I
write in
in
airports or?
I've written in so many airports. I've written on buses, trains, planes. Yeah.
So that's possible. Well,
May I ask you a question?
Yes.
Does that happen for you too? Do you write in transit sometimes? I mean, start poems.
I do, and
On the-
actually I've completed poems mid-air.
Yeah. Yes.
And there's something more buoyant, at least you believe there is for a while, about those poems. But I think it has to do with that it's a little bit terrifying to be in transit. It's a little bit terrifying to be on a plane, and there's something about the imagination that kicks into gear in a strange place for me, which is a little different than working in my writing room.
I see.
And sometimes it's just the energy. Maybe that's all that ever makes it into the poem. The energy of
I
that.
see.
But yeah,
I'm not afraid of flying, and I don't think it's. I don't have feelings of terror, you know, unless one is circling endlessly or something. But even then, actually, I tend to get very philosophical at those moments and kind of say, well, I guess this is it. No, for me, being on a train or a plane, or even a Greyhound bus, there's a wonderful feeling of freedom from what Cézanne used to call those hooks, you know. Nobody and nothing can get there, or it's hooks into you there. I mean, one may worry about someone who is waiting at the other end if the thing is late and there's no way of letting anybody know. So you feel that kind of anxiety, perhaps. But aside from that, you know, you leave the driving to them.
Right. Well, there's also that. I think that one of the things that feeds that for me is being anonymous, feeling absolutely anonymous on a plane or on a train, and anyone and no one. That sort of feeling, which tends to be.
It's lovely. It's like walking around a foreign city.
Right. Well, you have mentioned in many of your essays. Well, not many, but you have mentioned sometimes in your essays of keeping various kinds of journals. One of them you described sounds a bit to me like a commonplace book where you collect Wordsworth, for instance, how you had collected the poetry is not the dress, but the incarnation of thought. And then you mentioned keeping another journal. How does journal writing serve your poems? Do you actually write the whole poem in a journal, or is it just a matter of collecting? Is it a collection from which you choose later?
Well, I have written poems, first drafts, sometimes second drafts, in notebooks, along with that sort of commonplace material, or writing down dreams and the other kinds of things that I would put in the notebook. But I don't look upon the notebook as a source book for poems. Occasionally it turns out to be that, but I think the function of such a notebook is to keep in touch with yourself. It's to keep in touch with your inner life. And even if you never look back at it, never reread it, the activity is a way of keeping your imagination, what shall I say, oiled, or
Right.
and I think to look upon such a book very specifically as a source book is a bad idea, because then the tendency for students, for example, or any sort of beginning writer, is to make patchwork poems.
Right.
You know, a good observation there, a good line there, and they don't really have any essential relationship to each other, but you kind of stitch them together. I mean, I have not done this myself, but I have seen people do it, and I think it's a really bad thing to do. And I've heard of some some well-known poets who have done that sometimes, and I think there's something basically dishonest about it, really. It's not a real poem, it's a kind of, if it was openly a collage, that would be okay. Yeah, that would be a kind of found poem, except that what you found was in your own notebook. But it's when a person saves little sort of bon mots and then passes them off as a continuum. That's dishonest, I think, and results in an essentially empty poem.
Well, that's interesting, because in other words, for you, there's a sort of whole emotional subtext to how a poem comes into being, then, a whole sort of chorus going on around and outside the poem as the poem finds its voice.
Well, if one was going to attach any meaning to that word organic, which I have used less and less as time has gone by, well, it's a very good word, but, it's been so taken over for a couple of decades now by shampoo manufacturers and other purveyors of various items. It's hard to use seriously, but actually it's a very basic word which one should be able to restore to its proper function. And if one means anything by it, then that has to be. And the kind of patchwork poem that I was referring to is a betrayal of that possibility. I mean, it's possible that any one of those fragments that somebody has disguised as parts of a whole could have, in fact, given rise to a poem that would have been its own poem with authenticity.
Well, sort of backing up, because we're talking about the word organic, which I hear you. But I was curious, as in your essay, some notes on organic form. I mean, in some ways, did that come from Emerson for you? The notion of the organic, or
it didn't really come from Emerson, but when I found Emerson in my sort of self-educated wanderings, what he said kind of confirmed and articulated what I was already thinking and believing and trying to practice.
Because I having read and reread recently many of your things, is very much of an Emersonian, in the best possible way, Emersonian.
Well, I had been reading quite a lot of Emerson at the time that I wrote that essay, certainly. But as I say, I didn't sort of. I don't want to claim some kind of sublime originality. No, it's not that. But I mean, you know how one sometimes finds in something that someone else has written some confirmation of what one has apprehended, and you find that perhaps what you thought was original wasn't after all, because various people have thought it and expressed it before you.
Absolutely.
And so then you kind of join yourself onto them.
Let's see, let's sort of shift gears here a little bit. Well, you've written many books. Do you feel a particular affection for any of the many? I mean, if you were to look back, or do you sort of, are you most interested in the last book? Or
most interested in the last one, yes. And in fact, probably most interested in the poems written since the last book, yeah.
Well, we should maybe talk a little bit about your influences and how those have changed and evolved. You've mentioned that the German poet Rilke has served you as a kind of muse or mentor. What was it? His poems? Was it what he wrote about the poems?
It was more really his letters, you know. Although, of course, the poems too, but with my very poor, almost negligible knowledge of German, it takes translations to, I mean, I can sort of get at the German through translations because I heard a lot of German as a child. I know what it sounds like. I can even read it aloud so that I can deceive someone into thinking that I know what I'm reading. But the fact is that I don't know the grammar, and without knowing German grammar particularly, well, some other languages too, I mean, you know, you really are totally at a loss. There are just so many ordinary words I don't know. But I have, the poems that I wrote were, they're sort of variations on themes by Rilke. Right. I didn't use translations for those at all. What I did was sit down with certain poems that had not been translated, or at least I had never seen any translations of them, and I sat down with them and a friend who teaches German and went over them closely. I would read them aloud, and as best I could, and then I would try to give a sort of word by word or phrase by phrase translation as best I could. She would explain what I didn't understand. Then she would read me the poem, and then I would read it aloud again with her explanation fresh in my mind, and all the words that I had not known. You know, we had sort of talked about those words and how they could operate in other situations and things like that. And so by this process, I kind of got inside the poem, at least for the time that we were working on it and that I was writing my variation on a theme that I found in that poem. But that was much later. I mean, I'd been reading Rilke's letters for a long, long time, ever since I was about 21, 22, and reading poems in bilingual editions where I would read the English, and then with my smattering of German, with the crib, you know, I could sort of go back and read the German page too. But with the prose, you know, then I didn't try to read the original unless I was really puzzled about something and went to look, if I sort of had a feeling that could that be actually what he said, and then I might try to go back to the original with a dictionary. But
it was this idea of what a poet is, or why a poet writes.
Yeah, I think about the vocation,
must I write?
The vocation really of the poet. That was perhaps the biggest influence for me.
Well, other of your essays have discussed literary friendships with Muriel Rukeyser, for instance, and in Light Up the Cave, you have a sort of memoir of Robert Duncan and your relationship with him. Certainly your work as well has been very widely reviewed. Has what others have to say about your poems, friends, critics, influenced at all the direction of the work?
I'm sure that what close friends, particularly when I was younger, said, or what they were, if they were poet friends, what they were doing themselves. Of course, it must have been influential. Reviews, no, because I read reviews when the publisher sends them to me, and if they're good, I'm gratified. If they're bad, I'm either downcast or chastened, depending on who said what. And then I forget them. I truly do. I absolutely forget them. Essays are somewhat different.
Right.
And there are some people who've written essays about my poems, which were, I don't think they have really influenced the way I write, but they have been significant to me in as response and
Right.
as revealing to me certain things that I had done, or perhaps had not done, but
Illuminating them.
yes,
Right.
yeah.
So that you.
It's all, you know what it's like? It's like when you're talking to someone and you're looking at them face to face as we are now, and the other person's expression tells you so much. That's why I hate talking on telephone. No face to see, and you don't know whether what you've said is
Registering.
you don't know how it's registered. I mean, you presume that they can still hear you, or if there's a silence, you kind of say, "Hello, are you still there?" You know.
Right.
You can't. There's no way to interpret a silence unless the person is visible to you, and then a silent response can be very, very expressive. But anyway, that's something else.
Yeah.
But that quality of response, I think, is what, even if it's negative, if it's from people that you respect, is valuable.
Does it, do reviews especially ever surprise you? Or essays on your work? Have you ever been...
Since I can't remember the reviews, and that is the truth, I can't
Good.
say.
Well,
I don't remember. Was I ever
have you been
surprised?
surprised, I guess, by yourself? In other words, if you have a very good reader, someone who's reading your work so intelligently, and by way of
That's
their...
a fantastic experience. One kind of feels, oh, wow, I seem to have really, really done it. Now I can die. But you don't, and you go on and you produce some more stuff, and you don't know whether that one is going to make it or not. So,
Well, not so early on, but at one point you were adopted, I guess one could say, by something called the Black Mountain School of Poetry, a school that very much was interested in Charles Olson's ideas on projective
if I was
verse.
adopted, I was adopted as a token woman, I see in retrospect.
Oh, interesting.
I didn't realize it at the time, because I was so unaware of things like that. But
So that's interesting.
I think so, yeah.
Well, I was going to ask that, given that, and given the fact that you really were acclaimed by this particular school, what would you say in the long run would be the projective school's contribution to American poetry? I mean, since there are so many factions in American poetry, could you talk a little bit about...
I really don't think I can. No, I don't. The question throws me into confusion. I don't know what I think. Perhaps because I mean, there is so much poetry being written and published that one would have to be really a historian, or a sort of a social historian, a literary historian,
I mean, they were...
to be able to evaluate that.
Because it was simultaneous, wouldn't you say, with, say, Lowell's work, with which has now been...
Well, it overlapped. I mean,
the confessional.
Lowell was very well known and much read before the Black Mountain people began to be well known and much read. so there was an overlap, because he went on being famous and much read after they had started to be, but no, I don't know. I really don't know how to answer that question.
When you arrived in America, you've written that the work of William Carlos Williams really changed your thinking about poetry. What was it about his aesthetic that took hold? And have you, in your years writing since, do you still feel very close to Williams, or have you felt that you've grown beyond his particular influence? Or
I would never be so presumptuous as to say that I'd grown beyond him, because I think he was a really major writer whose work I love, but and from whom I feel that I learned a great deal, and he was a generous and lovable person, and I came to know him personally, and all of that was tremendously valuable to me. I don't feel that his influence is a. I think that what I learned from him, I have sort of absorbed, and it isn't what is most apparent in my work of recent years, and I don't even know what he would think of my poems today. He liked me, and he liked my poems, and he was rather surprised that somebody from England should have sort of appeared who seemed to understand what he was talking about in relation to the line and so forth. I have a letter that speaks of that, one of the letters I have from him. And I think that my rhythms and diction have tended to revert to my English beginnings as I've gotten older, and that might be a disappointment to him. And then a lot of my poems, the subject matter has become more and more theological, and that might, although some of his late poems are too. Definitely. So it's hard to say. I hope I wouldn't be a disappointment to him if he's sort of looking on from somewhere in another life and occasionally taking peeks at American poetry to see what's going on. I sure hope I'm not a great disappointment to him. But I don't feel that he's the active force in my life that he was 20 years ago, let's say. Right. But
he's there.
It's still not a question of going beyond, but perhaps I went off in some other directions, taking with me very much that he had given me.
Is there anyone in the last 10 years, for instance, who's any poet in America, who has so influenced you the way that early on William Carlos Williams did? Or
no, and I don't think that happens later, when a person gets older. It almost can't. I mean, it would indicate that they were so immature, so unformed, really, that even at an advanced age, they were, still being visibly, So there are many poets whose work I'm excited about and that I love and whom I read, but I don't think, as far as I can tell, that there is some influence. You could say, oh, she's been reading so-and-so,
Right.
And I think it would be sad if
that were a possibility.
Yeah, exactly.
Too much the chameleon.
Yes.
Yeah. Well, what contemporary poetry do you read? Do you read first and second and third books, or?
The last 2 or 3 years I've been reading, although I still don't feel that I know the poems, but I've come to deeply admire, rather belatedly, Czesław Miłosz. And there are a lot of younger poets whose work I like. I hate to start naming names because there are always so many people that one leaves out, but just names that rise to the surface easily.
What
Lee
is-
Young Lee would be
Absolutely.
one. I think he's certainly one. But there's so many others. I shouldn't even probably have really mentioned him, much though I like his work, because it sounds as if
Well, I
I'm
think-
singling out one
well,
person
though
above others. That's not it.
He does share something, I think, with Miloš in a way.
Do you think so?
Yeah, I think there's a kind
Oh,
of...
I think of them as very different, but
In terms of how a poem comes out, the idea of, well, the voice, that the speaker, which is in some ways, it seems to me, one of the problems, at least in my estimation, with American poetry, is the past tense narrative, the small narrative, the turning back always, the small moment. And there's a way which Lee Young Lee certainly locates himself in something else besides landscape, or locates himself in small domestic incidents, but they have that sense of the very particular, but also a sort of universality.
a context, a larger
Yeah,
context.
absolutely. And
Yeah.
I think Miloš too, the philosophical, is how Lee Young Lee is a much younger man than Miloš.
2 books just came out that I think I'll give it a little boost to. They're both by people who happen to have studied with me, but I don't sort of claim them. One particularly, because she really only studied with me for 1 quarter, and her name is Deborah Larson, and her book is called Stitching Porcelain, and the poem's about Matteo Ricci. That came out from New Directions. And then there's a Chicano poet called Benjamin Science, who has a book called Calendar of Dust, which was just published by Broken Moon Press in Seattle, and is very, very different. I don't think that these 2 books have anything in common, but except that they are both very good. And they're both first books.
Well, what other, what else do you read that feeds your work? I mean, do you read other genres? Like, are you particularly interested in nonfiction or
I read
history,
lots
or-
of fiction, but I don't know whether it really. Some of it, I'm sure, does feed my work in poetry, but a lot of it. I mean, I like reading things like Anthony Trollope, and I can't see that would have any relation to poetry or to my poetry in particular. On the other hand, when I read something like John Berger's Once in Europa, or Peter Handke, some of his fiction, that I feel is very close to poetry. I wouldn't say that I feel it as an influence, but it certainly is nourishing me and nourishing my imagination and my sense of the world. And so perhaps in an indirect way, it's nourishing my poetry too.
Do you ever research your poems? I mean, if you find yourself writing about a particular kind of flower or about a particular landscape, do you ever go to other texts, look up etymologies?
Well, when I was writing, but it isn't, of course, really a poem. It was written as a libretto. But when I was writing this libretto about El Salvador, I did lots of research into pre-Columbian Salvador for that, and I also, I obtained some documents about the nuns that were murdered, and I have a list of names in there that are real names of the many people that have been massacred in El Salvador. So for that I certainly did research. But, well, if I wanted to know the botanical term for some part of a flower, of course I would
look it up.
go and look it up. But
It's not
otherwise.
something that you don't read like ornithology texts or...
No.
Okay. It comes first through the poem. Well, I'll ask you one more question, and then maybe we'll turn to the audience.
Okay.
Which is there anything you'd like to do yet in a poem? This is probably a redundant question, but do you have any ambitions that you'd like to try in poetry?
I have to answer with a sort of negative wish. I hope to write more poems. I hope to go on writing poems. I hope that they will be good poems. And I hope that I won't sink as I become more and more antique into mere self-repetition.
Mm-hmm. You don't want to repeat yourself. I doubt that. I doubt you will. Well, we'll turn now to the audience. We have about 10 minutes.
This is a long-time reader and admirer of your poetry. It's something that struck me as very interesting is the interplay between what I would describe as the contemplative and the political of your poetry. I think in the 50s and early 60s it was more contemplative, calling forth in the reader a sense of wonder. And then in the 60s and early 70s, something happens. And after that, and I'm thinking of lines like Freeing of the Dust, for example, and a couple of poems in there, A Quiet Place, and May Our Right Hands Lose Their Cunning, where there's a kind of interplay between the contemplative and the political, and a kind of social conscience is all going to work. And I wonder if you could talk a bit about that interplay. They seem complementary to me.
A lot of people don't think they're complementary, you know. They think that they think it's a great pity that I ever embarked on any more political or engaged poems. For me, I came from a background of social concern, and indeed, in the 60s and early 70s, a lot did happen. Not just to me, but a lot was happening in the world. And I found myself writing such poems, and I found myself feeling obliged to write such poems, not from aesthetic obligation, but from social obligation. And I am aware that this is a great danger, and that poems that are written out of any sense of social obligation are liable not to be good poems. So what I began to develop was a concept of poems which would be political poems and yet have as much of the lyrical qualities of any other poem as any other poem. I think that's terribly hard to do, and I know that I have many times failed to do it, but my social conscience urges me sometimes into writing poems on these political, social themes, and my bent, my temperamental bent is often really at odds with my social conscience, because that's not the kind of poetry I prefer writing. I really prefer writing much more contemplative and lyrical kind of poems. But the occasional poem where I feel that I do manage to fuse the two kinds of poem and not write just a merely didactic poem which has a sort of temporary social function but no more. Write a poem which has that but also has some real poetic quality that enables me to keep trying to do this. sometimes my experience has been that poems will come in pairs, as a matter of fact, and the energy generated by writing one kind of poem will sort of spill over into the immediate writing of the other kind of poem. That's really all I can say about it. There is a certain amount of interplay, I suppose, but it's a somewhat uneasy one. And also because I was writing that kind of poetry, I found myself kind of taking on the role of defending the possibility of a political poetry, which, after all, there are many precedents for it throughout history, and there have been really good ones. It is possible. It's infrequent. That's the problem.
Are the fairies still present?
Well, I did actually see one when I was a child, and therefore, strange as it may seem, ridiculous as it may seem to some people, I have never ceased to believe that there are orders of being other than those which we commonly perceive. I see no reason why there can't be. There are other dimensions that we don't, that most of us, most of the time, don't recognize. But I don't really have any hope of seeing one again. I only saw one when I was very, very young, and only that one time.
You stated that you felt that you were a talking woman in the Black Mountain School. I was wondering if you could elaborate on that, and perhaps the role of women during that period for poets and who were trying to get their works published.
Well, I was quite unconscious of it at the time, but among that group, Creeley, Duncan, Olson, Paul Blackburn, that was the original group, really, and then there was me, and then there was a second wave of people who had studied at Black Mountain and so forth. I was never at Black Mountain myself, but I published in the Black Mountain Review and in Origin, and the New York school, Kenneth Koch and Kenwood Elmsley and leaving out Frank O'Hara, of course. I mean, that group, they had Barbara Guest. And it seemed as if at that period, each kind of little group of poets was mostly men, and then there'd be one woman. And looking back, I came to realize that that was the case with me, and I had been in that position unbeknownst to me. I mean, I also looked back when the women's movement began to really develop in its present form at the end of the 60s, early 70s. I looked back at magazines and anthologies that I had been published in, and noticed for the first time, I'm embarrassed to confess it, but I mean, it seems like such extreme egotism, but I really hadn't noticed that often I was the only woman, or one of, one of three, let's say, in so many places. And that's why I feel that. I don't mean to say that Robert Duncan and Robert Creeley didn't really like my work. They did, and we were friends. I never had a friendship with Olson. I met him maybe 3 times and never corresponded with him. And I have no idea whether he read or liked or disliked my work, but certainly Duncan Creeley and I were at that time sort of a mutual admiration society. Nevertheless, I was a token woman. And, you know, the second wave of Black Mountain poets was almost exclusively men. And a wonderful poet who actually, her practice was very much along the same lines. She had been influenced by the same people, by Pound, Williams, and then she'd been at Black Mountain, so no doubt was influenced by Olson too. I'm speaking of Hilda Morley. Right. Hilda Morley was ignored by those people for years. And Hilda Morley still doesn't have the reputation that she's very much respected by those who know her work. But she isn't nationally known in the way that a poet of her caliber should be. She kind of got edged out of the way because they didn't really need more than one. That's my theory. Yeah.
There's, at the same time as Alan came out with his anthology back in the 50s, there was an anthology, I think Donald Paul was one of the editors, and you were the only poet in both volumes.
Yeah, what happened was, the anthology you're speaking of was New Poets of England and America, and the first edition of it did not have any of the what Robert Lowell at that time had referred to as the raw. It only had the cooked. And then the Donald Allen anthology came out, which didn't have any of the cooked. It was all raw, a sort of raw bar. And then after that, a second edition of New Poets of England and America came out. It was edited by Donald Hall and Robert Pack, I think. And that did include me, so I was like the first sort of bridge person. You know, I think that nowadays there just are not, with the exception of the language poets, but there really are not sort of all these little schools anymore. I think it's much more diffused, and that people are more open to one another's work and to a broader range of work. At that period in the 50s and very early 60s, I think all these factions were terribly narrow-minded.
Maybe especially given the culture at that time, for good reason. I mean, that was so factionalized. Do you want to answer one more? Let's do one more.
Sure.
And then we'll go.
Obviously, poetry is a means of expression, but do you have any guiding view of what it is and why it exists and what you do with it?
Of what poetry is?
No, of how it fits in with the rest of the world. I mean, it's something to do and it's something to read and think about, but how does it exist in the form that it does? And what people do?
Could you repeat that? It's difficult to hear and understand. What's the function of poetry?
No. In the sense that there are structures in the rest of the world and that there are different modes of expression, do you yourself have any guiding view of the function of poetry in the rest of the world? Do any of you want to talk about that?
Well, how does it measure with the other arts, or what is it?
I think I still don't really understand the question, because you say there are structures in other aspects of the world. What structures do you mean? What kind?
There are ways that people do things and reasons that people express themselves and reasons that people do things in the form that they do. And I'm asking you.
So are you speaking, for example, of the other arts? Are you speaking of music, visual art?
No, society is a structured thing where people have things that they think they're supposed to do, rules that they follow. And poetry is one of the things that exists in that society, but how do you use it to fit into that?
I think that society is pretty chaotic, I don't see it as highly structured. I don't feel that I use poetry, and I would not wish to use poetry, because I think that to use poetry would be to misuse it. I hope to be used by poetry, not to use it. I don't feel that I'm properly answering your question, but that's because I don't really feel that I have grasped your question.
I think that was a good answer.
Thank you.
Thanks for listening. 92nd Street Y Unterberg Poetry Center webcasts and access to our archive are made possible by a generous gift in memory of Christopher Lightfoot Walker, longtime friend of the Poetry Center and the Paris Review. For more information on 92nd Street Y and the Paris Review, please visit us on the web. This program is copyright 1991 by 92nd Street Y and the Paris Review.